London, April 1816. The chandeliers of Lady Ashcroft's ballroom poured a golden glow across marble floors, so polished they mirrored the swirling silks of 200 guests, each one eager to witness what society had unanimously declared the most perfect match of the season. Cecilia Margaret Beaumont stood near the orchestra, her ivory gown catching the candlelight, and felt the weight of every approving gaze like a crown she had never asked to wear. At 22, Cecilia had mastered the art of being precisely what everyone expected: perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect acceptance of her perfectly suitable betrothal to Viscount Philip Somerset, a man whose kindness she genuinely valued and whose affection she had learned to appreciate, if not quite feel, with the passion poets described. The wedding was set for June, and she had told herself repeatedly that passion was overrated compared to security, respect, and the deep satisfaction of meeting every expectation placed upon her since birth. What she had not expected, what no amount of careful preparation could have anticipated, the tall figure entered through the ballroom doors at precisely that moment. 3 years absent from English society and wholly unaware he was about to shatter the perfect life of his closest friend's intended bride. If stories of impossible love and choices that defy every rule of honor move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. Cecilia felt the shift in the room before she understood its cause. Conversations paused mid-sentence, fans fluttered with increased urgency. Lady Dorothea Bancroft, standing near enough to touch Cecilia's elbow, leaned close with barely contained anticipation. "Alexander Carrington," Lady Dorothea whispered, her breath warm against Cecilia's ear. "The Marquis of Rothwell himself. 3 years managing family holdings on the continent, and he returns just in time for his dearest friend's wedding. How perfectly timed. How perfectly romantic." Cecilia's fingers tightened imperceptibly on her fan. She had heard Philip speak of Alexander countless times during their 2 years of courtship. His brother in all but blood, the friend who had stood by him through the death of Philip's father, the brilliant mind who had transformed failing investments into profitable ventures through sheer determination and unconventional thinking. Philip had mourned Alexander's absence deeply, his joy in their upcoming marriage shadowed only by the knowledge his closest friend would miss the celebration. Letters had crossed the channel regularly, but Philip's voice always carried a note of loss when he mentioned the years of separation from the man he considered family. The crowd parted like water around a ship's bow as the Marquis moved through the ballroom. Cecilia felt her gaze clung to his progress despite every intention to look away. Tall, certainly taller than Philip by several inches. Dark hair that wanted to curl despite obvious attempts to tame it. Evening clothes that fit with the ease of wealth and taste, though something in his bearing suggested a man more comfortable in riding boots than dancing slippers. He was scanning the crowd with clear purpose, searching for someone specific. Philip, undoubtedly. Cecilia felt a strange flutter in her chest that she immediately dismissed as nerves about the inevitable introduction. She would meet him, exchange pleasantries, and then he would become simply another fixture in the landscape of her new life as Philip's wife. It was then that Alexander's gaze swept across the ballroom and collided with hers. The moment stretched impossibly long. Cecilia felt as though every sound in the ballroom had muted. Every other person faded to watercolor softness, leaving only the sharp, unbearable clarity of gray eyes meeting hers across 20 feet of crowded space. She saw his posture change, saw something shift imperceptibly in his gaze that looked disturbingly like recognition, as though he had been searching for her specifically rather than for Philip. The sensation was so powerful, so completely unexpected, that Cecilia took an involuntary step backward and collided with the potted palm behind her. "Miss Beaumont, are you quite well?" Lady Dorothea steadied her with a gentle hand. "You've gone rather pale." Before Cecilia could formulate a response that made sense, Philip appeared at her side, his familiar presence both comfort and complication. His face glowed with uncomplicated happiness as he took her hand and placed it on his arm with the careful propriety that characterized all his gestures toward her. "My dearest Cecilia," Philip said warmly, his voice carrying the genuine affection that had led her to accept his suit in the first place. "I have the most wonderful surprise. My oldest friend has returned to England at last. I cannot wait for you to meet the man who has been brother to me since we were boys at Eton." Cecilia managed what she hoped resembled an appropriate smile. "How delightful for you, my lord. I know you have missed his companionship these 3 years past." "More than I can adequately express." Philip's hand covered hers where it rested on his sleeve. "Come, he is making his way toward us even now. You will adore him, I am certain. Everyone does." The crowd shifted, and suddenly Alexander Carrington stood before them, close enough that Cecilia could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested a man who spent significant time outdoors, squinting against sun and wind. Close enough to notice that his cravat, while perfectly tied, lacked the elaborate complexity fashionable among London gentlemen. Close enough to feel the precise moment when his attention fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the spring evening's coolness. "Philip." Alexander's voice carried a roughness that spoke of travel and weather and perhaps emotion. "My dear friend, it has been far too long." The two men embraced with the easy affection of true friendship, and Cecilia found herself grateful for the moment to compose her features and order her inexplicably scattered thoughts. This was simply her betrothed's closest friend, nothing more. The strange sensation of recognition had been imagination, nerves about the upcoming wedding, perhaps too much champagne, though she had barely touched her glass. When the men separated, Philip turned to her with such genuine pleasure that guilt pricked her conscience for reasons she could not begin to name. "Alexander, may I present Miss Cecilia Margaret Beaumont, daughter of the Earl of Northdale, and my most fortunate choice of bride." Philip's pride in the introduction was evident and entirely deserved. Cecilia was, by every measure society valued, an excellent match. "Cecilia, my dearest, this is Alexander James Carrington, Marquis of Rothwell, the man I have called brother since we were 15 years old." Cecilia extended her gloved hand, focusing every skill of deportment her mother had drilled into her since childhood. "My Lord Rothwell, I am honored to make your acquaintance at last. Philip speaks of you with such deep affection that I feel I know you already." Alexander took her hand, and even through 2 layers of glove, Cecilia felt the contact like a brand. His bow was correct, his words properly formal, but when he raised his eyes to hers again, she saw her own confusion and alarm reflected back at her. "Miss Beaumont." His voice had dropped lower, almost rough. "The honor is entirely mine. Philip's letters spoke extensively of your virtues, but I confess his descriptions failed to capture the reality." It was a proper compliment, the sort exchanged constantly in ballrooms throughout London. Yet something in his delivery, in the way his gaze held hers a fraction too long, transformed courtesy into something far more dangerous. Philip, blessedly oblivious, laughed with delight. "You see, Cecilia? I told you Alexander possessed impeccable judgment. He recognizes quality when he encounters it, even after years abroad developing a preference for continental manners." "My time on the continent taught me to value authenticity," Alexander replied, still holding Cecilia's gaze. "There is something to be said for seeing clearly without the distortion of social performance." Philip clapped his friend on the shoulder, mistaking cryptic words for simple friendship. "How I have missed your philosophical observations. You must dine with us tomorrow evening." "No, I insist absolutely. Cecilia's parents are hosting a small gathering, and there will be room for one more at table. We have 3 years of conversation to catch up on, and Cecilia deserves to know the man who will stand as my groomsman at our wedding." Cecilia's heart, which had been beating far too quickly, seemed to pause entirely. The wedding. Philip's groomsman. This man, This stranger who made her skin feel too tight and her thoughts scatter like autumn leaves would stand beside Philip as they spoke their vows, would be present at countless gatherings before and after the ceremony, would become part of the fabric of her life as Philip's wife. "I would be delighted," Alexander said, but his eyes, still fixed on Cecilia, told a different story entirely. The orchestra chose that moment to begin a new set, and Philip, ever attentive to propriety, requested Cecilia's hand for the dance. She accepted with relief, desperate for the familiar structure of steps and music and social performance that would allow her to regain the composure that had somehow fled entirely. As Philip led her onto the floor, Cecilia glanced back once and found Alexander watching their progress, his expression unreadable, but his stillness speaking volumes. Around him, the ballroom continued its glittering performance, but he stood apart from it all, a man unexpectedly caught in a storm with no clear path to shelter. The following evening arrived with the inevitability of fate, bringing with it a mild spring rain that drummed against the windows of Northdale House like nervous fingers seeking entrance. Cecilia stood before her mirror while her lady's maid, Henrietta, arranged her hair in an elaborate style that would be fashionable for another hour at most before being abandoned for simplicity. "You seem distracted this evening, miss," Henrietta observed quietly, securing a final pin with practiced efficiency. "Is the wedding preparations weighing on your mind?" Cecilia met her own eyes in the mirror and recognized a stranger staring back. "I am perfectly well, Henrietta, simply eager for the evening to progress smoothly." It was a lie. She had slept poorly, her dreams filled with gray eyes and impossible recognitions, waking repeatedly with her heart racing and her thoughts tangled in guilt she had no right to feel. She had done nothing wrong. Alexander Carrington was Philip's friend, nothing more. The strange moment in the ballroom had been imagination, nerves, or perhaps some peculiar atmospheric phenomenon that affected perception. Yet even as she formulated these rational explanations, her pulse quickened at the knowledge that in less than an hour he would be in her home, seated at her family's table, close enough to speak with and observe and be observed by in return. The dinner party numbered 12, a carefully curated selection of family and close friends meant to welcome Alexander back to London society while celebrating Philip and Cecilia's approaching nuptials. Cecilia's mother, the Countess of Northdale, had arranged the seating with her usual strategic precision, placing Cecilia between Philip and her father at one end of the table, with Alexander positioned across from them between Cecilia's younger sister, Arabella, and Lady Margaret Fotheringay, a widow of independent means known for her wit and intelligence. Cecilia told herself she was grateful for the distance. Conversation would be general, distributed among all guests, rather than focused on any particular pairing. She would perform her role as the perfect future Viscountess with her usual grace, and the strange tension of the previous evening would reveal itself as nothing more than first meeting awkwardness. This hope lasted approximately as long as it took Alexander to enter the drawing room where guests gathered before dinner. He moved with unconscious confidence through introductions and pleasantries. But Cecilia detected his focus as surely as she felt the weight of her pearl necklace against her collarbone. Every time she laughed at someone's observation or responded to a question, she sensed him tracking the sound of her voice, the tilt of her head, the gestures she made without thinking. And worse, far worse, she found herself doing the same. Noting the way he listened with complete attention when someone spoke to him, regardless of their social standing. Observing how his rare smiles transformed his serious features entirely. Catching herself wondering what thoughts moved behind his gray eyes when he looked at her across the drawing room with an expression that suggested both question and answer, neither of which she wished to acknowledge. "Miss Beaumont appears quite taken with your friend," Lady Margaret murmured to Philip, her voice pitched low, but not quite low enough to escape Cecilia's excellent hearing. "Though I suppose that is natural. The Marquis of Rothwell possesses considerable charm when he chooses to employ it." Philip's response carried the comfortable confidence of a man secure in his position. Alexander has always possessed the ability to put people at ease. It delights me to see my dearest friend and my future wife developing the friendship they deserve. We shall be quite a happy family, I think." Cecilia's fingers tightened on her fan until the ivory sticks threatened to snap. Family. Yes, that was precisely what Alexander would become. Philip's friend, her husband's closest companion, someone she would see regularly for the remainder of her life while carefully maintaining the appropriate distance expected between a married woman and her husband's unmarried friend. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like a door closing on something she had not even known existed until 2 days prior. Dinner was announced, and they processed into the dining room with the careful precedence that governed every aristocratic gathering. Cecilia allowed Philip to seat her, smiled at her father's gentle comment about how radiant she looked, and prepared herself to endure an evening of careful performance. She had not anticipated that performing would become so exhausting. Conversation flowed around the table with the ease of people comfortable in their social sphere. Cecilia's father, the Earl, inquired about Alexander's time managing family properties on the continent. Arabella, 17 and not yet officially out, asked breathless questions about Paris and Vienna that made their mother frown with gentle reproof. Lady Margaret engaged Alexander in a spirited discussion of agricultural improvements that revealed both her intelligence and the seriousness with which he treated her views. Through it all, Cecilia felt his attention returning to her again and again, like a compass needle seeking true north regardless of interference. She did not look at him directly. Instead, she focused on Philip, laughing at his gentle humor, discussing wedding preparations with appropriate enthusiasm, playing the role of contented bride-to-be with all the skill her 22 years of training had instilled. But when Philip turned to answer a question from Lady Margaret, when the general conversation shifted to politics and masculine concerns, Cecilia found her gaze drifting across the table as though pulled by forces beyond her control. Alexander was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat. Not the polite interest of a friend toward his companion's betrothed. Something far more complex and far more dangerous. Recognition, longing, and beneath both, a mirror of her own growing panic at the impossibility of what they both felt but could not, would not, dare not acknowledge. She looked away quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs with enough force she feared everyone at the table must surely hear it. This was madness. She was engaged to Philip, a good man who had courted her with patience and offered her security, respect, and genuine affection. Alexander was his dearest friend, a man of honor who would never pursue his companion's intended bride. Yet something had shifted between them in that first glance across the ballroom, something that mere honor and good intentions seemed powerless to undo. After dinner, when the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and politics, Cecilia found herself cornered by her mother near the pianoforte. "You seem unusually quiet this evening, my dear," the Countess observed, her keen eyes missing nothing as they had never missed anything throughout Cecilia's carefully monitored childhood. "Is something troubling you?" "Not at all, Mama." Cecilia managed what she hoped resembled her normal smile. "Perhaps I am simply feeling the accumulated fatigue of wedding preparations." Her mother's expression softened with sympathy. "It is indeed an exhausting business, though one that culminates in such happiness. Philip is an excellent man, Cecilia. You have chosen wisely, and I am proud of the sensible woman you have become." Sensible, yes. That had always been the highest compliment her mother could offer. Cecilia the sensible, Cecilia the obedient. Cecilia, who always chose correctly because she never allowed foolish emotions to cloud her judgment. Except that now, with Alexander Carrington existing mere rooms away, sensibility felt less like virtue and more like a cage she had helped construct around her own heart. When the gentlemen rejoined them, some 20 minutes later, Arabella was prevailed upon to perform at the pianoforte, her playing technically correct if lacking the passion of true musicianship. Cecilia stood near the instrument, turning pages for her sister, grateful for a task that provided both occupation and excuse not to engage in general conversation. Yet even focused on the music, she felt the moment Alexander moved to stand near the pianoforte, positioning himself where he could observe her profile while maintaining the appearance of listening to Arabella's performance. "Your sister plays admirably," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone beneath the cover of Mozart's bright notes. "Though I suspect you possess talents she has not yet developed." Cecilia kept her eyes on the music. "I play adequately, my lord. Nothing exceptional." "I doubt that." There was something in his voice that made her hands tremble slightly as she turned the page. "I suspect you do everything with exceptional skill because you have been taught that excellence is the only acceptable standard." She risked a glance at him and immediately regretted it. He stood close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, barely visible but suggesting some past injury or adventure. Close enough to smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and something wilder beneath the civilized veneer. "We are all bound by expectations, my lord," she managed to say. "I am no different from any other woman of my station." "I think you are entirely different." His words were so quiet, she almost doubted she heard them correctly. "I think you are extraordinary in ways you have been taught to hide so carefully that you may have forgotten they exist at all." Arabella's piece concluded with a flourish, and polite applause filled the drawing room, mercifully preventing Cecilia from attempting a response to words that felt like seeing herself reflected in water after a lifetime of believing mirrors told the whole truth. The evening ended as all such evenings must, with farewells and arrangements for future gatherings, and Philip's hand warm and steady on Cecilia's as he bid her good night with his usual careful affection. Alexander's leave-taking was correct, formal, entirely appropriate. Yet as he bowed over her hand in farewell, Cecilia felt his thumb brush across her glove in a caress so light and brief it might have been imaginary, and she understood with terrible clarity that nothing about the situation would be simple or safe or sensible. She was her father's sensible daughter, Philip's appropriate choice, society's approved bride. But somewhere beneath all those careful layers, something wild and frightened and desperately alive had begun to wake, and Alexander Carrington's gray eyes suggested he recognized that hidden self far better than was comfortable or wise or remotely acceptable. The following weeks passed in a blur of social obligations that felt increasingly like an elaborate performance in which Cecilia had somehow been cast in the wrong role. Wedding preparations accelerated with the inexorable momentum of a river rushing toward the sea, and Alexander became a constant presence in their lives as Philip joyfully reintegrated his oldest friend into every aspect of his London season. They attended the same balls, dined at the same tables, rode in Hyde Park during the fashionable promenade hour, with Cecilia mounted on her gentle mare between Philip and Alexander, acutely aware of both men and the impossible tension that existed between her consciousness and her duty. Society observed the trio with approval. How fortunate that Philip's bride and his dearest friend developed such easy friendship. How charming to see the Viscount's happiness reflected in the pleasure his betrothed and his oldest companion found in each other's company. How perfect that their upcoming marriage would not require Alexander to sacrifice his close connection to Philip. If anyone noticed the careful distance Cecilia maintained from Alexander, if anyone observed how their conversations remained resolutely general, never straying into personal territory, if anyone saw the way Alexander's jaw tightened when Philip placed a casual hand on Cecilia's arm, or how Cecilia's fingers trembled slightly when Alexander passed her a glass of champagne, they attributed it to nothing more than natural adjustment to new relationships. Only Arabella, with the unvarnished candor of youth not yet trained to polite blindness, seemed to sense something amiss. She watched her sister with concerned eyes during a particularly tedious music hall at Lady Waverley's townhouse, where Cecilia had positioned herself as far from Alexander as the drawing room allowed. "You avoid Lord Rothwell," Arabella whispered during a brief interval between performances. "Have you taken him in dislike? I find him rather fascinating myself, though I suppose one should not admit such things." "I do not avoid him," Cecilia replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. We are perfectly cordial. You are perfectly cold, Arabella corrected with the unvarnished candor of 17. You treat him with less warmth than you show our vicar, and you actively dislike Reverend Hutchins. Has he offended you in some way? Should I warn Philip? Panic fluttered in Cecilia's chest. You will do nothing of the sort. Lord Rothwell has been entirely proper. I simply find we have little in common beyond our mutual affection for Philip. It was perhaps the greatest lie she had told in a lifetime of careful truth-telling. She and Alexander had everything in common. The same dry wit that emerged in unexpected moments. The same preference for books over balls. The same awareness of social performance as performance rather than truth. The same hunger for something real beneath all the glittering superficiality. And most dangerous of all, the same dawning recognition that they had found in each other precisely what neither had been seeking, but both desperately needed. The situation reached its crisis point 3 weeks before the wedding, during a house party at the Somerset family estate in Wiltshire. Philip's mother had planned the gathering as a final celebration before the ceremony, inviting both families and close friends for a week of country entertainments and wedding preparations. Cecilia arrived with her parents and Arabella on a warm afternoon in late May, the Somerset estate spreading before them in all its pastoral beauty. Ancient oaks lined the drive, gardens bloomed with early roses. The house itself, a graceful example of Palladian architecture, seemed to embody everything stable and traditional about English country life. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like walking toward her own imprisonment in a cell constructed from her own good choices and inability to reach for anything beyond what was appropriate. Alexander had arrived the previous day, Philip informed them cheerfully as they gathered in the main drawing room for tea. He had gone riding that morning and would join them for dinner. Philip spoke of his friend with such uncomplicated affection that Cecilia felt guilt twist in her stomach like a living thing. She had done nothing wrong. Neither had Alexander. They had been scrupulously careful, maintaining proper distance, never allowing themselves to be alone, speaking only when necessary, and then with perfect formality. Yet the wanting between them had grown rather than diminished, fed by proximity and impossibility, until the air felt charged whenever they occupied the same room. The week stretched ahead like a gauntlet. Cecilia was not certain she possessed the strength to navigate. Dinner that evening proved her fears justified. The gathering was smaller than the London crush, perhaps 20 guests total, creating an intimacy that large balls avoided. Cecilia found herself seated beside Alexander at table, with Philip across from them engaged in animated conversation with his cousin about estate improvements. You look tired, Miss Beaumont, Alexander said quietly, his voice pitched beneath the general conversation. Is the excitement of upcoming nuptials proving overwhelming? Cecilia took a careful sip of wine before responding. I am perfectly well, my lord. Country air always requires adjustment after the London season. Indeed. His tone suggested he knew precisely how hollow her words rang. Though I confess, I find the country infinitely preferable to town. There is something to be said for spaces where one can breathe without constant observation. She risked a glance at him and found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch despite her best efforts at composure. Constant observation can be wearing, she agreed, her words careful, but her meaning clear. Particularly when one is always putting on a mask, he continued, his voice still quiet but weighted with layers of significance. Always playing a role written by others rather than chosen for oneself. Cecilia's fingers tightened on her fork. We are all bound by roles, Lord Rothwell. Society functions because we accept our parts gracefully. And if the role does not fit? His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her skin warm, despite the evening's coolness. If one finds oneself cast in a performance that feels increasingly like fiction rather than truth, she could not breathe properly, could not think past the dangerous implications of words that danced so close to confession. Then one learns to fit the role, she managed to say, because honor demands it. Honor. He spoke the word like a curse and a prayer combined. Yes. Honor demands a great deal of us, does it not? Sometimes more than we possess the strength to give. Before Cecilia could formulate a response that did not reveal too much, Philip turned his attention to their section of the table, his smile warm and inclusive. Alexander, you must tell Cecilia about your improvements to the Rothwell estate drainage system. She has expressed interest in agricultural innovations, and your work has been quite remarkable. It was kindly meant, Philip's constant effort to help his betrothed and his friend develop their own friendship. He could not know that every gesture of inclusion felt like twisting a knife already lodged too deep for removal. They spoke of drainage and crop rotation and tenant cottages, their words perfectly appropriate and their attention carefully divided between Philip and the broader conversation. To any observer, they were simply doing what society expected, forming the comfortable triangle of friendship that would support Philip and Cecilia's marriage for decades to come. But beneath the polite words, beneath the careful performance, something dangerous continued to build, like storm clouds gathering beyond the horizon, promising lightning and destruction and transformations that could not be undone once they struck. The following day brought activities designed to showcase the estate and provide entertainment for guests. Morning rides through the countryside, afternoon archery competitions on the lawn, evening cards and music in the drawing room. Cecilia participated in all of it with her usual grace, maintaining perfect deportment while feeling increasingly like a woman drowning in shallow water. It was during the archery competition that disaster finally struck, though not in any form Cecilia might have anticipated. She had withdrawn from the competition after several rounds, her skills adequate but unremarkable, preferring to observe from beneath the shade of an ancient elm. Other guests milled about the lawn, their laughter carrying on the warm afternoon breeze. Philip had been called away to consult with his steward about some minor estate matter, leaving Cecilia momentarily alone. Or so she thought until Alexander appeared beside her, moving with the quiet grace that characterized all his movements. "You shoot better than you demonstrated," he observed, his attention ostensibly on the current competitors. "I watched you in the first round. You deliberately aimed slightly off-center." Cecilia kept her eyes forward, unwilling to risk looking at him when no one stood near enough to chaperone or observe. "I see no purpose in excessive displays of skill at social gatherings. Others enjoy winning far more than I do." "You diminish yourself." His voice carried frustration barely held in check. "You deliberately make yourself smaller, less remarkable, less everything than you actually are. Why?" "Because society prefers women who do not outshine others," she replied, her own frustration finally breaking through. "Because excellence in women is admired only when it does not threaten masculine pride or make other ladies uncomfortable. Because I learned long ago that perfect performance means knowing when to fail gracefully. That is the most dismal principle I have encountered in 33 years of living." Alexander turned to face her directly, abandoning all pretense of watching the archery. "You are extraordinary, Cecilia. Why can you not see that?" The use of her Christian name should have shocked her, should have provoked immediate correction. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing either of them had said in weeks of careful performance. "What I see," she said quietly, finally meeting his gaze despite knowing the danger inherent in doing so, "is that I am betrothed to your dearest friend. A good man who deserves far better than a wife who cannot stop thinking about someone she should regard as nothing more than pleasant acquaintance." The words hung between them like confession and catastrophe combined, and Cecilia immediately wished them unspoken, even as relief flooded through her at finally speaking truth after weeks of careful lies. Alexander's expression shifted through surprise to something that looked like pain and hope tangled together beyond separation. "Do you imagine I am unaware of your thoughts? That I have not spent every moment in your presence fighting the same impossible battle?" Then we must fight harder, Cecilia insisted, though her voice trembled with the effort of maintaining conviction. We must find a way to transform whatever this is into appropriate friendship. Philip deserves nothing less than our complete honor. Philip deserves honesty, Alexander countered, his voice rough with emotion, barely contained. What honor is there in a marriage built on performance rather than genuine affection? Cecilia stepped back as though he had struck her. I hold Philip in high regard, she confirmed. He is kind and good and has treated me with nothing but respect and consideration. Care is not love. Alexander moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Respect is not passion, and convenience is not destiny, despite what society insists we believe. What would you have me do? The question burst from Cecilia with more force than she intended. Break my engagement 3 weeks before our wedding? Destroy Philip's happiness and my family's pride? Become a scandal that follows me the remainder of my life? All for the sake of feelings that might prove as insubstantial as morning mist? What if they prove as substantial as the ground beneath our feet? Alexander's eyes held hers with devastating intensity. What if we are standing at the precipice of something real, something true, and we turn away because we lack the courage to reach for it? It is not about courage, Cecilia said, though her voice had lost its certainty. It is about honor and duty and keeping one's word. Even if keeping that word means living a lie for the next 50 years? Cecilia had no answer to that question, none that satisfied the terrible conflict tearing her apart from within. She stood frozen beneath the elm tree, aware of other guests' laughter carrying across the lawn, aware of sunshine warming her skin, aware of Alexander standing close enough to touch through propriety-demanded distance, and felt the careful architecture of her perfect life beginning to crumble. Miss Beaumont, Arabella's voice called from near the house. Mama requests your presence. Something about the seating arrangements for tomorrow's dinner. The interruption broke the spell, allowing Cecilia to step away from Alexander with a murmured excuse that satisfied neither of them. She fled toward the house with as much dignity as haste allowed, her heart hammering and her thoughts in complete disarray. That evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. Cecilia sat beside Philip at dinner, listened to his gentle observations about estate management, accepted his casual touches on her hand or shoulder with appropriate warmth, and felt like the worst sort of fraud. She was deceiving him. Not through action, but through omission. Not through words, but through the careful editing of truth. Philip believed himself beloved, or at least held in deep affection. He believed his upcoming marriage would be happy, and his friend's presence would enhance rather than complicate their shared lives. The truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous than anything Philip's trusting nature could imagine. 2 days later, the situation reached its breaking point in the worst possible location. The house party included an extensive library, and several guests had commented on its remarkable collection of first editions and rare manuscripts. Cecilia, who had always found solace in books, retreated there one afternoon when the gathered ladies' conversation turned to topics that required enthusiastic participation she could not muster. She had been examining a beautifully illustrated volume of poetry for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the library door open and close quietly behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the other guests, and found Alexander instead. They stared at each other across the space of the library, and Cecilia understood with terrible clarity that whatever came next would determine the shape of both their futures. "I did not mean to intrude," Alexander said, though he made no move to leave. "I was seeking temporary escape from Lord Fitzroy's interminable discussion of hunting techniques." "The library often provides such refuge," Cecilia managed to say, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Though perhaps we should return to the others. It would not be appropriate to be found here alone." "Probably not," Alexander agreed. But he did not move toward the door. Instead, he moved closer to where she stood, his expression carrying a complexity of emotion that made her breath catch. "Tell me to leave, Cecilia. Tell me you feel nothing, that the past weeks have been imagination on my part, and I will walk away. I will stand beside Philip at your wedding and smile and never again speak of this impossible thing between us." Cecilia's hands tightened on the book she held, its pages crinkling slightly under the pressure. Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to protect Philip and her family and her own carefully constructed future. But something deeper, something she had suppressed for so long she had almost forgotten its existence, refused to perform anymore. "I cannot tell you that," she whispered. "I cannot lie about something that has become the only true thing in my life." Alexander crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 strides, and suddenly he was close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell sandalwood and something uniquely him beneath. "Then tell me what you do feel," he said urgently. "Give me truth, even if we can do nothing with it. Let there be honesty between us in this moment, whatever comes after." Cecilia looked up at him, this man she barely knew, and yet recognized more deeply than she recognized herself, and let the careful walls she had maintained for weeks finally crumble. "I feel as though a veil has been lifted from my entire life until I saw you across Lady Ashcroft's ballroom," she confessed. "I feel as though every choice I have made, every person I have been, has been preparation for someone else's idea of who I should become. And then you looked at me, and I saw myself reflected in your eyes, and for the first time in 22 years, I felt awake." Alexander's hand rose to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "I am in love with you," he said simply. "Not with who you pretend to be or who society expects you to become. With you, Cecilia, the woman who shoots arrows off-center to protect others' pride. The woman who reads poetry in libraries when she should be discussing bonnets. The woman who has learned to hide so perfectly that she has almost disappeared entirely. I see you, and I love what I see, and I am terrified that you will marry Philip, and I will dedicate my life to ensuring you never again feel invisible or small or anything less than the remarkable woman you are." Tears slid down Cecilia's cheeks, hot and unexpected. "What are we to do? There is no honorable path forward. Philip is your closest friend. The wedding is announced. My family has planned everything. We cannot simply declare ourselves in love and expect the world to accommodate our feelings. I know." Alexander's voice carried the weight of impossible understanding. "Believe me, I have spent weeks searching for a solution that preserves honor while allowing truth. I have found none. But I also know that marrying Philip while loving someone else is not the answer. You will both suffer for it, and suffering in service of false honor is not noble. It is simply sad." "He will be devastated," Cecilia whispered. "Philip has been nothing but good to me. He deserves better than this betrayal." "He deserves a wife who loves him completely," Alexander countered gently. "Not one who settles for affection while her heart belongs elsewhere. That is not kindness, Cecilia. That is cowardice disguised as duty." The word coward struck her like a physical blow because she recognized its truth. She had been brave in so many small ways throughout her life, but never in the one way that mattered. She had accepted every limitation, fulfilled every expectation, played every assigned role with perfect precision. Because being brave, truly brave, meant risking everything comfortable and certain for something that might prove illusory. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, though she already knew the answer and feared it more than anything she had ever faced. "End the engagement," Alexander said quietly. "Be honest with Philip. Face the scandal together rather than living separate lives forever. It will be difficult. Society will judge harshly. Your families will struggle to understand. But we will face it together, and we will build something real from the ruins of false perfection. And if you are wrong," Cecilia's voice trembled. If what we feel proves insufficient to sustain us through years of social ostracism, if we destroy Philip's happiness and our family's pride only to discover we were in love with the idea of each other rather than the reality, then we will have the consolation of knowing we chose honestly, Alexander replied, that we reached for truth rather than settling for comfortable fiction. I cannot promise you ease, Cecilia, but I can promise you that if you give me your trust, I will devote every hour to ensuring you never again feel invisible or small or anything less than the remarkable woman you are. Cecilia stood in the library, surrounded by thousands of stories about heroes and choices and transformations, and understood that she stood at her own crossroads. Behind her lay everything safe and expected. Before her lay nothing but uncertainty and the terrifying freedom of choosing for herself rather than for others. I need time, she said finally. This decision will affect too many lives to be made in a moment of emotion, no matter how strong that emotion feels. Alexander nodded, though disappointment flickered across his features. Of course. But Cecilia, understand that time is not infinite. The wedding approaches. Every day you delay makes the eventual reckoning more painful for everyone involved. I know. She stepped back, needing distance to think clearly. Please, we must return to the others before our absence is noted, and we must be more careful. If Philip suspects anything before I have had time to consider properly, it will make everything immeasurably worse. They left the library separately, Cecilia waiting 5 minutes before emerging with a book she would not remember selecting. She rejoined the ladies in the drawing room, smiled at Arabella's questioning look, and returned to the performance she had maintained so flawlessly all her life. But something had changed irrevocably. The mask felt looser, the role less certain. And when Philip sought her out that evening to discuss their upcoming wedding journey, she found herself looking at him with new eyes and aching awareness of the pain her honesty would inflict. That night, Cecilia lay awake in her guest room while the house settled into silence around her. Through her window, she could see the gardens bathed in moonlight, beautiful and peaceful and utterly indifferent to the human complications unfolding within the graceful walls. She thought of Philip, sleeping in confidence that his wedding would proceed as planned, that his friend and his betrothed had formed the friendship he hoped for, that his future contained nothing but the happiness he had worked so carefully to build. She thought of her parents, her mother especially, who had sacrificed and planned and guided Cecilia toward this perfect match with the dedication of a general planning a crucial campaign. She thought of Arabella, who looked up to her elder sister as a model of proper behavior and successful navigation of society's demands. And she thought of herself, the woman she had been and the woman she might become if she found the courage to reach for something beyond what others expected. The choice, when it crystallized in her mind sometime before dawn, felt simultaneously like the easiest and hardest decision of her life. She could not marry Philip while in love with Alexander. Whatever the cost, she could not stand before God and family and pledge herself to a man she cared for but did not love, knowing that love existed elsewhere if only she possessed the courage to claim it. But neither could she simply break the engagement and flee into Alexander's arms like some Gothic heroine abandoning all honor for passion. Philip deserved better than that. He deserved honesty, as much explanation as she could provide without destroying him completely, and time to recover before the social world descended with its judgments and speculations. The following morning, Cecilia requested a private audience with Philip in the estate's small study. He agreed immediately, his expression pleasantly curious rather than alarmed, and she understood that nothing in their previous interactions had prepared him for what she was about to do. They stood facing each other in the morning light, and Cecilia felt tears already forming, though she had not yet spoken. "Philip," she began, her voice barely steady, "I must tell you something that will cause you pain, and I am sorrier for that than I can adequately express." His smile faded, replaced by concern. Philip balled his hand into a fist as he said, "My dear Cecilia, what troubles you? Whatever it is, surely we can address it together." "That is precisely what we cannot do," she said gently. "Because what troubles me is the marriage itself, or rather, my suitability to be your wife." Philip's confusion was evident and heartbreaking. "I do not understand. You have been everything I could hope for in a bride. Have I done something to offend or disappoint you?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than intended. "You have been nothing but good to me, Philip, but I have not been honest with you, and I cannot in good conscience proceed with our wedding while maintaining that dishonesty." "Then tell me the truth," he said simply. "Whatever it is, we will find a way forward together." Cecilia took a breath and spoke words that would shatter everything. "I am in love with someone else, not through any action on my part or his, not through seeking or encouraging or any behavior that crosses into impropriety. But the feeling exists, and I cannot marry you while my heart belongs elsewhere." Philip's face went through a series of expressions too rapid to catalogue individually, landing finally on a careful blankness that suggested intense feeling being forcibly suppressed. "I see," he said, his voice remarkably controlled. "And this gentleman, does he return your regard?" "Yes." "Is it someone I know?" This was the moment Cecilia would have given anything to avoid, but she had chosen honesty and would not now retreat into partial truth. "It is Alexander." The silence that followed felt crushing in its weight. Philip stood absolutely still, his face losing all color, his eyes wide with shock that was transforming rapidly into something far more painful. "Alexander," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "My closest friend, the man I called brother. You are telling me you have fallen in love with Alexander." "I am so desperately sorry," Cecilia said through tears now flowing freely. "I never wanted this. Neither of us sought it. But it exists nonetheless, and I cannot build a marriage on the foundation of denying it." Philip turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with emotion being forcibly contained. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality Cecilia had never heard before, something broken beneath the careful control. "Did he pursue you? Did he seek to undermine our engagement deliberately?" "No." Cecilia moved slightly closer, though she did not dare touch him. "Alexander has been nothing but honorable in his conduct. If anything, he has tried harder than I to maintain distance and propriety. This is not seduction or betrayal through action. It is simply a truth neither of us wanted, but both of us must acknowledge. A truth that destroys everything," Philip said bitterly. "My upcoming marriage, my closest friendship, my trust in both the people I believed cared for me most in this world. The accusation was justified and cut deeply." "I know," Cecilia whispered. "I know what this costs, and I know you have every right to despise us both. But proceeding with a marriage where my heart belongs elsewhere would cost even more in the long term. You deserve a wife who loves you completely. I cannot be that woman, though I deeply wish I could." Philip remained with his back to her for a long moment before turning to face her with an expression that mixed heartbreak with something harder, colder, more final. "You are correct on one point," he said quietly. "I do deserve better than this, better than a betrothed who could not manage basic loyalty, better than a friend who would betray decades of brotherhood for the sake of infatuation. Philip, please understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his voice like ice over deep water. "You have made your choice, and now you must live with its consequences. As must I. The engagement is ended as of this moment. I will inform my mother and handle the social ramifications as I see fit. You will return to London immediately. And Alexander," he paused, swallowing hard. "Alexander is no longer welcome in my home or my life. Tell him that when you see him next, which I imagine will be quite soon given the evident urgency of your attachment." Cecilia wanted to protest the harshness, wanted to plead for understanding or forgiveness, or at least acknowledgement that this situation was tragedy rather than calculated betrayal. But she recognized that Philip needed his anger now, needed the protection it offered against the full weight of his hurt. "I will leave within the hour," she said quietly. "And Philip, truly, I am sorrier than I can express for the pain I have caused you. You are a good man, and you will find someone who can love you as you deserve to be loved." "Please leave," Philip said, not looking at her. "I cannot. I need you to leave now." Cecilia left the study with haste and tears, nearly colliding with Alexander in the corridor beyond. One look at his expression told her he had been waiting, had perhaps even overheard through the door, and understood what her presence there meant. "It is done," she said simply. "The engagement is broken." Relief, guilt, and something more complex than either warred across Alexander's features. "And now?" "Now I return to London to face my family's disappointment and society's judgment." She met his eyes steadily despite her tears. "If you still wish to marry me after the scandal this will create, you may call on my father in 1 week's time. But Alexander, understand that I am choosing you while causing enormous pain to someone we both care for. If you have any doubt about your feelings or your commitment, now is the time to voice it before we move forward." "I have no doubt," Alexander said firmly. "None whatsoever. I will call on your father in 1 week exactly, and I will spend every day thereafter proving that your choice was not made in vain." Cecilia nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. She returned to her room to pack, endured her mother's scandalized confusion at their sudden departure, and left Somerset Estate without seeing Philip again. The scandal broke over London society like a cannon shot through the ballrooms, sudden and devastating and impossible to ignore. Miss Cecilia Beaumont, the season's perfect bride, had broken her engagement to Viscount Somerset mere weeks before their wedding, and rumors swirled about the cause. Some claimed she had discovered Philip kept a mistress. Others suggested gambling debts or secret children or a dozen other fabrications designed to explain the inexplicable. But when the Marquis of Rothwell called on the Earl of Northdale and emerged an hour later with Cecilia on his arm, the true story became evident to anyone with eyes to see. The perfect Miss Beaumont had fallen in love with her betrothed's closest friend, and apparently passion had trumped propriety after all. The judgment was swift and harsh. Matrons who had praised Cecilia for years now cut her at social gatherings. Friends who had clustered around her during her engagement suddenly found pressing engagements elsewhere. Even Arabella faced social consequences, with several mothers withdrawing permission for their daughters to associate with the sister of such a scandalous figure. Cecilia's mother alternated between tearful recriminations and stunned silence. Her father, after hearing the full story in private, had expressed disappointment but also understanding that surprised Cecilia. He had, in his youth, witnessed the quiet misery of a marriage built on convenience rather than affection, and that memory colored his judgment. "I will not pretend to approve of the pain you have caused young Somerset," the Earl said quietly. "But neither can I force you to marry without love simply to satisfy social expectations. If you believe Lord Rothwell is truly your choice, then you must follow your heart and accept whatever consequences arise." Alexander proved as steadfast as his promise. He called daily, endured the pointed stares and whispered commentary with dignity, and began making arrangements for a quiet wedding that would take place far from London's judgmental eyes. 3 weeks after Cecilia broke her engagement, she and Alexander traveled north to Gretna Green, that famous refuge of couples whose love outweighed their patience for social approval. They married in a simple ceremony with only Alexander's valet and Cecilia's maid as witnesses, speaking their vows with absolute conviction despite knowing the price they would continue paying. Their wedding night was spent in a modest inn, and if Cecilia wept both from happiness and residual guilt, Alexander held her and promised that they would face everything together, exactly as they had chosen. They settled at Alexander's estate in Kent, living quietly and receiving few visitors as society slowly, grudgingly began to accept their union. Cecilia discovered she had talents beyond perfect performance. She took over management of the estate's charitable works, revolutionizing the way tenant cottages were maintained and establishing a school for workers' children. Alexander, freed from the constraints of maintaining friendship with someone who no longer acknowledged his existence, threw himself into agricultural innovations that transformed his holdings into a model of progressive estate management. They had a son within a year of marriage, a dark-haired child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's serious disposition. They named him Thomas, carefully avoiding any name that might remind Philip of their connection. But despite the happiness they built together, despite the love that grew deeper rather than fading with familiarity, they could not entirely escape the shadow of what their union had cost. Alexander wrote to Philip repeatedly over the first year, attempting reconciliation, or at least some form of communication. Every letter was returned unopened. Cecilia, for her part, wrote Philip a single letter on their son's first birthday, not to brag, but to express again her deep sorrow for the pain she had caused and her genuine hope that he had found happiness in the years since. She did not expect a response and received none. It was in the spring of their third year of marriage that everything changed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed to Alexander in Philip's familiar hand. Alexander stared at the envelope for a full 5 minutes before opening it, while Cecilia watched with her heart in her throat. Philip's letter was brief and precisely written, but its content was revolutionary. He was to be married himself in 6 weeks' time to Miss Charlotte Fairweather, daughter of a prosperous landowner whose estate bordered Somerset lands. He had met her 2 years prior when he had retreated to the country to recover from the devastation of the broken engagement. And their courtship had been slow, careful, and built on genuine affection that had transformed into love. And he was inviting Alexander and Cecilia to the wedding. "It is a peace offering," Alexander said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he did not bother hiding. "He is extending forgiveness, or at least the possibility of it." Cecilia took the letter with trembling hands and read Philip's careful words about Charlotte, about how she had taught him that what he felt for Cecilia had been respect and affection, but not the passion that makes a marriage truly happy. About how time and distance had allowed him to understand that painful honesty had been kinder than comfortable deception. And most importantly, about how he hoped they might rebuild some form of friendship, acknowledging that the past could not be undone, but the future remained unwritten. "We must attend," Cecilia said, tears sliding down her cheeks for the first time in months. "Even if it proves awkward beyond bearing. He has offered us grace we did not earn. We owe him at least our presence." They traveled to Sussex on a warm day in June, bringing their young son and arriving at the church with both hope and trepidation warring in their hearts. The ceremony was lovely, intimate rather than grand, and Charlotte proved to be exactly the sort of woman Philip needed. Gentle without being weak, steady without being dull, capable of genuine warmth that suggested she would make an excellent Viscountess. The reception was held at Somerset House, and it was there that the true reconciliation occurred. Philip approached them in the garden where they had retreated with Thomas, who was investigating flowers with the intense focus of a 2-year-old. "Thank you for coming," Philip said, his voice carrying none of the coldness Cecilia remembered from their last meeting. "It means a great deal to Charlotte and to me." Alexander extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Philip accepted it. The clasp was firm yet fraught with history, and Alexander said, "I have missed you, my friend, more than I can adequately express. And I you." Philip's eyes shone with emotion. "Though I needed time to understand that what I missed was the friendship we had, not the future I thought we were building. Charlotte has taught me what love should feel like, and I realize now that I was asking you, Cecilia, to accept far less than you deserved." Cecilia felt tears threatening again and fought them back through sheer force of will. "You were offering me security and kindness. Those are not small things. But they are not everything, Philip replied gently. And you were right to refuse them in favor of something more complete. I was angry for a long time, but anger has given way to gratitude. You saved us both from a marriage that would have satisfied society while slowly suffocating us. Alexander's arm came around Cecilia's shoulders, and she leaned into his strength gratefully. Can you truly forgive us? She asked Philip quietly. Or is this simply polite tolerance? Philip smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. I forgive you, he said firmly. Not because the pain was not real, but because I understand now that sometimes love requires difficult choices. You chose honestly rather than easily. That takes courage I did not appreciate at the time. Thomas chose that moment to toddle over with a crushed flower, presenting it to Philip with the solemn ceremony of a 2-year-old making a gift. Philip accepted it with surprising grace, kneeling to the boy's level. Thank you, young man. What is your name? Thomas, Cecilia said softly. Thomas Alexander Carrington. Philip's eyes met hers with understanding. A fine name. I suspect he will grow up to be as stubborn and principled as his parents. They stayed at the reception for several hours, and before they departed, Charlotte took Cecilia's hands with surprising warmth. I am glad you made the choice you did, she said quietly. Not because I wish Philip had suffered, but because his suffering led him to me, and your suffering led you to happiness. Sometimes the painful path leads to destinations that could not be reached any other way. 5 years later, the two couples had become genuine friends, their children playing together during visits, and their relationships evolved into something neither strained nor performative. They gathered at various estates throughout the year, celebrating births and christenings and small triumphs with the easy affection of people who had survived storms together and emerged stronger for the experience. Alexander and Cecilia sat on the terrace of Rothwell Estate one evening, watching their 3 children play in the garden below. Thomas had been joined by twin daughters, Charlotte and Margaret. Do you ever regret it? Alexander asked, his arm around her waist as the sun set over Kent countryside. The scandal, the ostracism, the pain we caused Philip? Cecilia considered the question seriously, as she always did when Alexander asked difficult things. I regret the pain, she said finally. I wish we could have found our way to each other without hurting someone we both cared for. But I do not regret choosing truth over comfortable fiction. And I do not regret you, not for a single moment of any day we have shared. Alexander pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. Nor I you. Even when it was difficult, even when society judged us harshly, I never doubted that you were worth every sacrifice required to call you mine. Below them, Thomas shouted with laughter as his sisters chased him through the roses. The sound carried on the evening air, joyful and uncomplicated, the sound of children who would grow up knowing their parents had chosen love over expectation and honesty over performance. In their parents' choice, the children held the living proof that happiness could be wrenched from the very jaws of disaster. And watching them, Cecilia understood that the scandal which had once defined them had become simply part of their history rather than their entire identity. They had survived judgment and emerged not as perfect, but as honest, not as scandal-free, but as genuinely happy, not as society's ideal couple, but as 2 people who had found each other despite every obstacle and built something real from the ruins of false perfection. Years would pass, children would grow, estates would flourish under their careful management. Philip and Charlotte would remain dear friends, their own children playing with the Carrington offspring without awareness of the complicated history that had brought all their parents to this point. And sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and the children asleep, Alexander would ask Cecilia the same question he had asked in Lady Ashcroft's ballroom all those years ago. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had been sensible? If we had ignored that first recognition and proceeded with appropriate distance? And Cecilia, would answer the same way every time, with absolute conviction built on years of experience rather than momentary passion. We would have lived half-lives, performed our roles with perfect precision while dying slowly inside. And we would have robbed Philip of the chance to find Charlotte, who loves him in ways I never could. Sometimes, my love, the sensible choice is actually the coward's choice, and we were brave enough to reach for truth when it mattered most. Alexander would pull her close then, and they would lie together in comfortable silence. Two people who had chosen the difficult path and discovered that difficulty, when faced with honesty and commitment, transforms into something that looks remarkably like grace. The scandal that had once defined them became simply a story they told their children years later, a tale of choices made and consequences faced, and love that proved stronger than social approval. Thomas and his sisters would grow up understanding that real courage sometimes means disappointing people you care about in service of deeper truth. That honor is not always found in meeting expectations, but sometimes in having the strength to defy them when they lead toward fiction rather than truth. And they would understand, watching their parents navigate decades of genuine partnership and mutual respect, that the best marriages are not built on convenience or social approval or even initial ease. They are built on the willingness to choose honestly, face consequences together, and construct something real from the ruins of what others expected. Cecilia Beaumont Carrington, once the season's most perfect bride, became known eventually not for her scandal, but for her charitable works and progressive management of estate resources. Alexander Carrington, Marquis of Rothwell, earned respect through his agricultural innovations and his evident devotion to his family. And Philip Somerset, Viscount, lived happily with his beloved Charlotte and their growing family, secure in the knowledge that painful honesty had led each of them to the happiness they deserved. The story that had begun with scandal and heartbreak transformed over time into something different. A testament that sometimes love requires difficult choices. That honor is found not in perfect behavior, but in truthful living. And that the bravest thing anyone can do is reach for genuine connection, even when the cost seems impossibly high, because living honestly is always preferable to dying slowly behind the mask of perfect performance. And in the end, that was the legacy they left their children and the lesson society slowly, grudgingly learned to accept. That love, when built on foundation of truth rather than convenience, can weather any storm and emerge not just intact, but stronger, deeper, and infinitely more valuable than anything achieved through careful adherence to expectations that serve appearance rather than reality. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, courage, and the transformative power of choosing truth over comfort.